Hello, Michael Stack here, Principal of AMAX, founder of Comp Club, and co-author of Your Ultimate Guide to Mastering Workers' Comp Costs. So this is my second part in a three-part series detailing the discussions and events at the Workers' Compensation Summit that was hosted in Dallas on May 10th and 11th, 2016. That event was hosted by Bob Wilson from WorkersCompensation.com and Deputy Chief Judge David Langham. 39 stakeholders came together in order to talk about the current status and future of our industry, because there have been questions about the fairness and adequacy of workers' compensation, and if that's the right solution to handle workplace injuries. So these 39 stakeholders represented various different interests, including employees, employers, injured workers, claimants' attorneys, defense attorneys, medical providers, a whole host of experience, knowledge, and perspective to have this important discussion. In the first part of this three-part series, I went over those pre-summit documents, and if you have yet to review that video, I highly recommend that you do. There is information in there that you have not seen before, a study you haven't seen, or a letter you haven't seen. I guarantee you're going to pull out an important piece of information that you didn't previously know. So if you haven't seen that video, I highly recommend checking it out. In this video, then, I'm going to be talking about really the bulk of our discussion over the course of those 2 days. This discussion that we had was in regards to the imperative issues and some of the friction points that are causing the challenges in the work comp system. The discussion is not about whining or complaining about where we are. It's about identifying from a very pragmatic standpoint what these problems are and listing them out so that then we can now start talking about the solution and talking about a positive and productive outcome for this national conversation. In my last video, then, I'll be talking about really the regulatory points and some paradoxical incentive points that really exist, and now where we take this conversation from here. So as I mentioned, in this video, I'm going to be talking about really a 12 to 14 hour discussion that was had. And I want to preface this video by saying it's going to be really impossible for me to do that discussion 100% justice. There was so much perspective and so much information that was shared over that 12 to 14 hours. I'm going to do my best to give you a summary of that information really in the matter of a few minutes. So I'm going to do my best to do that, but just preface that by saying it's going to be very difficult to do that complete discussion justice. So that being said, the main categories of imperative issues that were identified will really fall under 6 umbrellas. The first is different incentives that occur. The second is the complexity of the system. The third then is the perceptions and human emotion. Fourth being the fraud and malingering and those different elements that exist in the system. Fifth is fairness and adequacy. And then finally, the alternatives to work comp and some of those different issues that are going on. So let's talk first about incentives and some of those imperative issues that exist under that umbrella. So when you talk about incentives, you look at some of the financial incentives being the main driver. And of course, when you talk about financial, you need to realize that the longer a claim goes on, the more a claim goes south, the more money is generated. The more vendors get involved, the more medical providers get involved, the more treatments are occurring, the more people are involved in this claim, the more money that generates. And that's called the churn. So a lot of money is made off of the churn. And there's a lot of lobbyists and efforts in order to preserve that because of the financial incentive that exists. The more involved a claim becomes, the more money that generates. Major point not to be discounted. Second point from an incentive standpoint is the state competition. So the fact that we have 50 different states and 50 different state laws lends workers' compensation to being a tool to keep employers in your particular state if you're a regulator, or to attract employers to your state if they are not currently there. So you think about this from a national perspective. States have significant financial benefits in job creation, benefits to the economy, higher taxes, etc. when a large employer relocates to their state. And when another state loses that large employer, it's a significantly negative impact on that state's financial economy. So the competition between the states and the use of workers' compensation as a tool to attract employers to either stay in their state or not, or attract them to move to a new state is a significant financial incentive. Again, not to be discounted, these financial different incentives that exist. Okay, so next point then is complexity. So a lot of discussion on this point. A lot of discussion surrounding complexity and the various different influences that occur with this. So let's talk first about regulatory complexity and get some scope on this. And it was very interesting when you're starting to hear national employers, large employers, you're hearing national carriers and TPAs discuss this point, because it starts to really give you that perspective of what this looks like. So imagine you're a large employer or a large carrier or TPA. You have 50 different state laws. The point was made that there are 300 forms that are updated every quarter nationally. 300 forms updated every quarter nationally. If you're a claims handler or a self-insured, self-administered employer, trying to keep pace with those regulatory changes is a huge financial burden in order to do that. Second piece then is when you're talking about these regulations and trying to get states to agree on certain points. We talked many times about how it is impossible to get states to agree to even what the poster looks like, what the design is, and what goes on that poster. It's been attempted in a few different occasions, and they've not been able to agree. So if the states can't agree on what a poster looks like, how are they going to agree on some of the more complex state law issues? Huge regulatory burden, and when you now think about what that means as far as finances and staff and additional resources that need to be applied, you start then to see, okay, now we need to generate some more money and some of those financial incentives then that are kicked in because of that regulatory burden and some of those different elements that are in place. Next point there is lawyers in the system. Different perspectives, of course, that come with looking at lawyers. A lot of times they're viewed as a benefit. A lot of times they're viewed as a negative, depending on who you are and the attorney that you're working with and the perspective that you're bringing to the table. We know from data when lawyers are involved, the claims are more expensive. When lawyers are involved, the claims become more expensive. That's not to say that they're not needed in the system, but a lot of times it's driving up costs, driving up legal briefs, driving up more administration, more following these regulatory issues, and not necessarily creating a better outcome for those injured workers. So lawyers in the system certainly add to the complexity depending on the perspective that you're looking at, but no doubt adding to the complexity, the lawyers in the system. Next, the different roles of different individuals and the delineation of those roles. So this was discussed primarily in the light of adjusters. So adjusters are often asked to be attorneys, they're often asked to be doctors, they're certainly asked to be claims handlers, and they're put a huge caseload, sometimes in excess of 300 case files, in order to try now manage this very complex system that we're discussing with a huge caseload and a huge amount of work, and asked to make these decisions that they may or may not be qualified to make. So really putting that complexity on top of that individual. Next under this role is really you start to talk about the vendors, and the amount of vendors that are involved in our system because of this complexity creates little cottage industries that pop up in order to now handle that complexity within our industry. It was mentioned how if you walk through a national convention, just the sea and the maze of vendors, if you had no idea what you were looking at, you would have no idea what you were looking at, because it's hard to really understand what that is. So now you talk about those roles and those number of different vendors and the adjusters and all the different people now that are contacting the injured worker. So if you're an injured worker, you had no idea about the work comp industry before getting injured. You really didn't care much about it. Now you've got maybe 1, 2, 5, 7 different people that are contacting you, and you're trying to make sense of the whole thing. So no wonder you're contacting an attorney, because you want to make sure that your needs are protected. So that makes a lot of sense, and really that overwhelming need of different people that are involved in this industry trying to make it extraordinarily complex. Final piece then is really staffing and training. So when you talk about the role and the burden that's put on the adjuster, and again, it goes back to, certainly going back to this financial incentive. Carriers are in the business of making money. They need to make a profit. And so oftentimes people are asked to do more with less, and that is certainly one of the functions that come into play when you're talking about those roles that the adjusters are asked to play. It goes down to the staffing and training. There's been a lot of studies that have come out in regards to the amount of people that are going to be retiring from our industry and trying to attract the next generation of talent to now fill in those gaps. And now how do we get that next generation trained to understand all of this complexity, make these decisions for these proper outcomes? Certainly an issue that falls under the imperative issues umbrella. Next piece then, so that talks about the complexity. Next piece then we're going to be talking about is this perception and human element. So the perception and human element. So oftentimes when we're talking about state laws, we're talking about finances, we're talking about claims management, it's so often that the human element and the injured worker get left behind, get forgotten. There was a statement made throughout the course of our discussions during the time that the injured worker is no longer relevant to the conversation, which is such an obscene statement. But when you start talking about the laws and the regulations, you forget that this is an injury to an individual. That individual has fears, anxiety, emotions. They may have a family. They may have a job that they're wondering if they're ever going to get back to. They're going to wonder if they can ever pick up their child again or their grandchild. These are very human emotions, and that factor needs to be taken into account when we're talking about this work comp system, where it is and now where it's going. So let's talk about that, the injured workers and sort of their perception of workers' compensation. Workers' compensation has a bad reputation among injured workers. Certainly more in other states, in some states than others, but it has a bad reputation. One of the individuals that was in attendance in Dallas was an injured worker. She shared her experience with us. She had a significant injury, and when she went to the hospital, started to talk to people, started to talk to medical providers, started to talk to different people within her circles, the perception was, oh, you have a work comp injury, you better get an attorney, you better watch your back. That's the reputation that is in play that we're fighting against as an industry. She had significant mistrust. She had significant fears, not only because of the injury that she had, but now this system that she's going into that everyone is telling her is not going to treat her well. A bad reputation creates that additional fear, that additional anxiety. One of the things that she mentioned very specifically in her story was she had a nurse case manager that was working with her. She made that nurse case manager sit in the hall during her medical appointments because she didn't trust that that nurse case manager was there to help her. It took about 6 months for her to start to realize that person was really there out for her best interest, and now invited her in and worked together then towards that positive outcome. But it was that bad reputation that led to that mistrust. Next piece then is then you talk about why do these cases then go over the edge. If you look at back to those documents that I talked about in that first video, there was a letter from ACOM to NIOSH that stated that 5% of cases make up 80% of the lost time and claims costs in workers' compensation. 5% of cases make up 80% of the lost time and costs in workers' compensation. Why are these cases going over the edge? Why is it that this small percentage of cases are going over the edge and causing these huge dollar amounts? When these claims go south, it's causing these huge dollar amounts and huge claim costs. One of the documents, again, referenced in that first video was the ACOM guidelines on preventing needless work disability. And again, they resonate, again, that same message of that small percentage of claims that's causing this huge amount of dollar amounts and huge amount of costs, and preventing that. And goes over very specifically recommendations to prevent those small cases that turn into now these big cases. A couple of factors that they reference in that document. This is the employee mindset and the shift in mindset, this human emotion, this human element that now comes into play. And the mindset of that individual changes from now I want to get better to how do I maximize my settlement? How do I now play the sick role and now maximize and make my story as bad as possible? And you tell that story over and over, and you tell it over and over, and you tell it over and over, and then that changes the thinking in your mind to now say, I'm in this poor situation, I need to be compensated for that, and I need to maximize that settlement, instead of I need to now get back to work. And it's a very different mindset and different change in thinking. Those are the type of things that are going to start to push those cases now over the edge. And again, now it's focusing on the system and how the system is now set up to handle that, because most of the time it's not set up to handle it. It's not set up to handle those psychological needs, and the carriers are not interested in now adding that psychological element to the claim because they're fearful of what that's going to mean as far as that claim cost. And so the system isn't set up to manage really that human element. The medical providers aren't necessarily trained for it. This idea that if you fix my arm, I'm ready to go back to work. But there may be some psychological factors that are not allowing me to go back to work. So those psychological factors, the system is not designed to handle them. So next piece here is fraud and malingering. So we didn't spend a ton of time on this particular point, but it's an important point to certainly discuss and mention. So the element here is that a lot of the fraud and malingering is viewed to have happened by the employees. But the discussion in Dallas was that this is really happening more amongst the employers. In the terms of misclassification of employees. This could be in a couple of different ways. Classifying employees as independent contractors, putting them in the wrong class code, or just not reporting that employee altogether, in an attempt to save work comp premium. Misclassification by employers of their employees causes them to pay less premium. Now the carriers have to not get premium for that individual, but when that individual person gets hurt and the judge deems that they were improperly classified, the carrier is then on the hook to pay for an injury in which they never collected a dime of premium. Causes a significant financial burden then on those carriers in order to make those payments for those individuals that they have never collected premium for. Next piece then is the bad actors in the system. The point was discussed that very similar to the small percentage of claims that are causing the large percentage of costs and lost time in work comp, same concept applies here in regards to the bad actors, that a very small percentage of individuals or providers are causing a large percentage of these problems. So the example was given throughout the discussions of the utilization review in California. And it's been identified that there's approximately 10 or so doctors that are causing the vast majority, maybe with 70 or 80% of the utilization review requests in the entire state. Very small percentage of the doctors causing a very large percentage of those utilization review requests. We know that there are these bad actors in the system. We know that there is a small percentage of individuals causing a large percent of these challenges. How do you now stop that? How do you prevent that from happening? That's an imperative issue that we discussed throughout the course of those 2 days. Last piece here in the fraud and malingering section is using evidence-based medicine as a cookbook in order to drive up these costs. And here was the example that was given there. Let's say the medical provider has a treatment that they want to do, and maybe that treatment requires 10 or 12 different sessions. But the evidence-based medicine says that you're only allowed to do 6 of those particular treatments. So they send that request to utilization review. It goes up there and they authorize an additional, say, 3 treatments. So now they had 6, now they have another 3. Now they're doing those treatments. They send the request back again. And now they authorize maybe another 2 treatments. So now they're up to 11 treatments. And now they have to do a couple more treatments, so they send another request back to utilization review, in order to get that treatment. So again, that's going back to that idea of the churn and using that evidence-based medicine, using some of those triggers and levers within the system to now drive up these costs. Okay, so the next category then is on fairness and adequacy. So fairness and adequacy issues. A lot of discussion on this topic over the course of that 2 days. One of the most important pieces of this, I think, that we discussed was in regards to permanent partial disability. So permanent partial disability and the adequacy of those benefits. When you look at the scope of this, and I think this is an important point to understand, and you look back at that first video, one of the studies in there was the effects of cost shifting from workers' compensation to Social Security disability. And it was a study done by the National Bureau of Economic Research in 2010, and they were trying to identify if there is or is not cost shifting between those two systems. Their conclusion from that study was that there is not cost shifting. There's been other studies that have done that show that there is cost shifting. So that theory is really up for debate. But one of the statistics that they stated in that study was that 66% of costs in the work comp system are from permanent partial disabilities. 66% of the costs in the work comp system are from permanent partial disabilities. They deemed about 17% of costs from temporary total disabilities and about 17% from permanent total or death. A very small percentage of the claims, again going back to that idea, very small percentage of the claims, a very small percentage of the stories are causing a large percentage of the costs. And so now how do we address that? This goes back then to some of the studies like from ProPublica that have come out that reference the cost of an arm in one state versus the cost of an arm in another state and the wide swings and variations between the two. So a significant issue to understand those differences in the states and then the adequacy of those benefits. And now you start to go back to understanding what a big cost driver this is and going back to that idea of the competition between the states and how you could see that maybe a small change in a state law could lead to a significant financial incentive for an organization. So next piece here then in the fairness and adequacy then brings down to then the adequacy of benefits and the differences between the states. One of the stories that was shared which was interesting and gives some perspective on this particular issue between the states, is there could be two workers working for the same company in two different states. They have the same injury at the same time, and that injury is compensable in one state and not compensable in the other. Very dramatic example of this benefit adequacy and those differences then between the states and how that then plays out from a regulation standpoint and from a claims management standpoint when you're trying to understand and implement these jurisdictional changes across those 50 states. So benefit adequacy then between the states and the comparison of those different things, particularly under this category then, was also the average weekly wage and those maximum limits and those various differences between those two states and the amounts, those caps that can be occurred, the differences that makes for that individual. Next piece then here is occupational diseases. Occupational diseases is not a new thing. It was actually mentioned in the 1972 report as a major issue. As our continued advancements in medicine, we continue to learn more about how diseases are procured and how long it takes for some of those symptoms to show up. And so what is and is not covered in occupational diseases, certainly an imperative issue and a major issue as we discuss the current status and future of the work comp industry. Finally, the point here there under the fairness and adequacy is employee representation. It was stated again in that work comp National Commission report from 1972, and it's really generally recognized that the perception of employees and employers and even state regulators and the general public is they don't really care about work comp. You don't really care about it or understand it because you're not injured. It's a small piece of the pie and there's a lot of other things going on. So you don't really care about it until you have to care about it if you're injured or, of course, if you're in our industry. So having uninjured employees being represented at the table in this discussion is a challenge because getting that level of interest, trying to get that group to care about what we're talking about is difficult unless it directly impacts that person. So the employer representation, the unions certainly could be invited. They represent a smaller portion of the workforce, but having that representation at the table in this discussion to talk about this fairness and adequacy issue. So the last piece then is talking about alternatives to work comp, and alternatives really to the current work comp system as it operates and as it stands today. The leading topic, of course, in this discussion is opt-outs. And opt-outs was viewed as a reaction really to all the different challenges and imperative issues that we've discussed in Dallas and that I've outlined on today's video. It's not viewed as an responsible alternative, however, because it doesn't adequately represent the grand bargain. It doesn't adequately represent benefits for the injured employees and just leaves too much to chance that the employers are going to do the right thing, which we know from those financial incentives doesn't always happen in 100% of those cases. So opt-out certainly as an alternative, but not a responsible alternative at this point. Other alternatives, you've got the Colorado single payer bill that's on the table, has yet to be voted on. This takes the whole health insurance system and puts it under a single payer system. The impact of that, if that will pass or not pass, and the impact of what that means for the rest of the states and the rest of our industry has yet to be seen, but certainly an imperative issue to be aware of and see what happens and how that develops. Next piece then is federalization of the work comp system. And we saw from John Burton's study in 1972, it made this statement, and then more recently in 2015, made the statement that it's not realistic for the federal government to completely take over the work comp system. It's really best as a state-based system, but that doesn't mean that the federal government won't get involved. There was a letter from the 10 congressmen and women really causing and bringing awareness to some of these issues that we're talking about the deterioration of benefits and how the federal government might want to step in to provide some of this regulations and provide some guidance. So really that issue of federalization and the threat of the U.S. government, federal government getting involved, and then once they are involved, how do you then control that involvement? Which then leads to the last point here, which is the National Commission. And is it time for another National Commission to give those recommendations such as they did in 1972? And again, if you didn't watch that first video, the scope of that 1972 report was a one-year study. They had about 15 different meetings among the commissioners. They had about 12 different town hall meetings. They had a 30-person full-time staff. They reviewed over 200 documents. It was a very thorough and complete study of the work comp system back in 1972. So is that where we are today? Maybe that is, and maybe it's not. It depends on your input, it depends on your perspective, and where we want to see this discussion go from here. Which leads me then to what we'll be talking about in the final video, which is those regulatory points and some of those different incentive points, and going a little bit further into that topic, and then talking about what does this look like from here? What do you want to see this look like from here? What is your perspective? What is the ultimate goal? What is the ultimate outcome that you would like to see from this conversation? And I'll be talking about that more in the next video. So thank you again for your participation. Thank you for your interest in this discussion. This discussion can't move forward without your participation and without your input. So remember, your success in workers' compensation is defined by your integrity. So be great.